with Ben today. So the prompt is, how does this make you think differently about the history of computing? And also, general reactions to the story.
Yeah. So this is an interesting story. I don't know much about programming languages. I mean, I basically program full time, but I don't know. So it seems like there's this class of programmers who like sort of love programming for the programming. I've always ever handled it as sort of just something I have to do, like a tool for my job. And it's not something I obsess over or even care about that much in terms of this language can do certain things, this language can do other things. I mean, I like the idea of Rust being more robust against certain issues you might have. But in my mind, the language is almost irrelevant. What matters is the libraries you can easily get. If you can easily get a lot of really good, high quality libraries, then it feels like, all right, you can piggyback off a lot of work other people have done, which makes your life a lot easier. Versus perhaps maybe the language, this other smaller language, is perfect and it's vastly easier to write in, but you have to do a whole lot more writing and thinking in order to get to the same point. But I mean, this is not a strong philosophy. I don't have. I mean, C++ has infinite libraries for it, and I still don't like that language. So that's I guess blabbling in general. But this particular Erlang, I didn't know that much anything about it until I'd heard of it vaguely. But it's an interesting story. It's interesting because I sometimes I forget that 1988. When I was born is actually not that long ago and quite long ago. It's been a while. That's when open source was starting, and how this language, because nowadays of course Golang, Google just made it open source and gave it out. And it's not because Google is a bunch of nice people. It's because they knew that that's what they needed to do to make the language successful. I would not be using Golang if it was some kind of closed Google product. I don't think many people otherwise would be using it either. So it's interesting that the sort of learning experience of, this is a new language, so the spread is more important than any sort of control you might attempt to have over it. And it looks like that they designed it for this like one sort of telecom environment and ended up abandoning it. And then, another telecom environment, WhatsApp, came in. And ended up, using it to be very successful. So it's interesting how, something that's created, a tool is created for one group who end up abandoning it, turns out it's really successful in someone else's hands. So that's interesting. Another thing I remember from the article is I don't think I've ever heard of Ruby, the language, except as Ruby on Rails. And I always find that humorous. Supposedly, did people actually write things in Ruby before Rails existed? I'm sorry, this might be my ignorance showing. I'm sure there are people who love languages, programming languages, I mean, and they're like, oh yeah, this esoteric thing was built in it, and it has these cool properties that I don't know about. Anyway, I'm sorry if I'm a bit dismissive. I feel like this is all, I think, what was it, Ben Katz called this turpentine effect, where when programmers get together, they all start talking about the best language or the thing, and I don't know. I find that kind of a little boring. Anyway, but that's probably just me. So I'll move it on. I'm not sure where we're going, but up or down would be fine, I guess.
Yeah. Go down to Grigory.
It is not like I have a coherent picture of the history of computing in my head, or even the history of WhatsApp beyond the headlines, which I barely remember. And the headlines was something like a very small team being acquired for a whole lot of money. And in this article, there is some numbers about it. So the team was 35 engineers, and it was acquired for 16 billion. So it gives you some idea about how revolutionary it was. Very small team, a whole lot of money. And at the moment of acquisition, it was not profitable or something. Revenues were 10 million and losses were like 140 million. So a revolutionary deal. The deal was revolutionary, I would argue. In my view, the language the backend was written on is probably not the most important factor in whether a messenger is successful or not. Back then, as far as I can remember, there was a lot of messengers. There's a lot of attempts to crack this nut. But some of them became stars like WhatsApp or Facebook messengers, and some of them we don't even remember most of them. Like as far as I can remember, Yahoo had a messenger, something. America Online had a messenger or something. So there was a lot of attempts to create a compelling messenger. The point is that probably in case of WhatsApp, the technology is not as important as the network effect. And the network effect is achieved not because of the language the team is using, but by some kind of other means. There can be a connection, but I doubt it. I believe that hundreds of millions of users don't mind what programming language the application is written on. But the team optimized for the team size, meaning that they wanted the team to be small, and at the same time being able to support like hundreds of millions of users, which again was some kind of a revelation that a very small team can support hundreds of millions of users. Again, as far as I remember, Facebook Messenger was optimized for different set of parameters, and that's why they either did not use Erlang or abandoned it for a different solution. So finally, probably the biggest idea that WhatsApp founders had was not language they used, but initial business model. Like charge millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, just a little bit, $1. And by doing that, undercut both telecom operators and messengers that are available for free, but with ads. It was not obvious back then that this can work, that you can undercut both, that you can undercut a free option and default option. But they kind of succeeded. And then again, I probably said it already, I'm not a WhatsApp person. I mean that I kind of hate the app. And I will pass it on to Venkat.
Yeah, this was interesting. I think we read one more thing about Erlang. The guy who wrote a PhD thesis about it after, I think it was Armstrong. Well, one of the founders wrote the PhD thesis later, and I think we read some portion of one of the chapters. But yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think one of the reasons I've never been able to be a professional programmer is whenever I talk to good programmers, they always act like, oh yeah, once you learn one programming language, they're all similar and you can easily like move from one to the other. Whereas I never found it easy to move at all. So to me, programming languages are as difficult to learn, each one being different, like human languages. So I don't get how professional programmers seem to learn many and become I don't know, linguists of some sort. But I was thinking about a line I heard long ago, which was the history of programming languages is taking features from Lisp and adding them to C, or is it the other way around? But anyway, so people think of C and Lisp as kind of like the two basic types of languages. And you get new languages by kind of like mixing and matching. So you can think of them as some of the eigen languages or Ur languages. And I was just thinking about, does Erlang fit on that spectrum? And I just posted on the Slack I'm in, asking the opinion of some programmers. And interestingly, they all kind of said that Erlang doesn't really belong on the C to Lisp spectrum, and it really should be considered one of the independent sort of programming paradigms. And I guess that makes sense, since it includes, so just like Lisp has that whole recursive list processing AI sort of like sentence rewriting sort of mental model of programming, and C has like a much more low-level hardware, tied to hardware thinking of programming. Erlang has its sort of like kind of basic unique features, one of them being this extremely high concurrency. But the other one, I think, is the idea of like crash only. So that the article mentions it briefly about you can't stop the telephone switch to update the code. But I think the idea goes back earlier. I don't know if you've read about it in this group, but Crash only started with the Ada programming language. But basically, the idea is once you start a program, there's no graceful way to shut it down, because there is no idea that it will ever get shut down. So I think the joke about Ada was, if you have software running on a missile, the normal way you terminate it is the missile blows up. So it's one of the few programming languages, I believe, that supported like true infinite loops, because you die with your death. But anyway, crash only is one of the fundamental assumptions of Erlang. So this is kind of like a second-hand opinion. I don't know enough to hold it as a first-hand opinion. But yeah, you can think of C, Lisp, and Erlang as three of the sort of like Ur languages, or maybe it's good to think of it as like the French cooking mother sauces. So maybe there's a couple more. But it's interesting to think about that. So that's one thing that struck me, and that I think explains why, despite the Erlang switching use case and the WhatsApp like high-level messaging use case being separated by 20 years and a few layers of abstraction, it's not surprising that WhatsApp ended up using it, because yeah, it must have many of the same characteristics that just low-level telephone switching has, right? So that makes sense. The other thing that occurred to me is the history of computing, as I've always understood it, is a very UK and US centric story. So the early story starts in the UK with Alan Turing and the ENIAC and some of the early World War II type computing, Enigma and stuff. And then the history switches to the US with the von Neumann computer at the Institute for Advanced Studies. And after that, with IBM and DEC and other things, it basically stays in the US. So the very simple version of the history of computing is first 10 years in the UK, then the remaining like 70 years or whatever in the US, and everybody else is kind of like a side plot or sideshow and not very important. But I don't think that's actually true, because significant and important threads began and continued elsewhere. So Erlang, I think, is one of them, starts in the Scandinavian world, even though I think two of the three inventors, so Armstrong and Mike Smith, seem to be British. I think it still has like the DNA probably of Scandinavian technology companies. And that got me thinking about, are there other important threads that begin elsewhere? So I think many of the modern scripting languages actually are not sort of Anglo in origin. So Ruby came out of Japan. I think Python and PHP came out of somewhere in continental Europe. I forget where exactly the founders came from. But it's kind of interesting, I think, that it's quite possible in the last 25, 30 years, without anybody truly noticing, the history of computing and programming suddenly got way more international than people realize. And not just in the sense of people around the world were doing it, but the fact that, I don't know, fundamental philosophy and design thinking behind it got to be very different. So, for example, a lot of people say that Ruby is a very beautiful, poetic language and claim that that has something to do with that fact that it came out of Japan. So, I don't know. I don't have that much taste to make these judgments, but it's kind of interesting. And it would be interesting to poke at this and see, did sometime in the late 80s to early 90s, did programming become culturally international somehow, where the different threads had like different design and architectural styles, reflecting the different parts of the world where they came from. So that would be kind of interesting. I think that's all I had to say. Let me see. Hold on. Sorry, my iPhone locked. All right. Passing around to Anant.
Thank you. I'll give a shot. I thought the article was really good. I learned about it's a very interesting story to learn about an origin story of a language within a private company and some of the troubles that they had in sort of gaining mass adoption, which I thought was interesting. It seems like one of the reasons, at least in the comment in the Substack, I think the top comment was said along the lines of the proprietary language was somewhere in cost Erlang from not getting adopted everywhere because they had to teach other programmers this new language, and also they weren't sure if the competitor and computing vendors could have the compilers that might be required to run Erlang. So that was an interesting anecdote, and it just, I mean, I guess I don't have much else to say other than the fact that it seems there's some parallels between the development of like human spoken languages and computing languages. There are a lot of different dialectics, and each for its own purpose. And I thought that was interesting. And I sort of used ChatGPT to sort of see if I can categorize or group the evolution of languages from like say 50s or 60s, and it sort of gave me a rough, what I thought was a good mental map for me in terms of it put it in like 6 categories. From first generation in the 40s and 50s, it was largely just machine language with binary code, to like later on to assembly languages, and then the sort of 60s and 70s were a lot of scientific computing with Fortran, which sort of where I have personal experience with Fortran or Python. And the 5th generation, which it put as like 1980s, was domain specific, which seems like where Erlang could have come out of. So I thought that was interesting. And also, I found the error handling of Erlang. It's sort of trying to see how it handles error. It's sort of let it crash seems to be the philosophy, given the sort of fault tolerant and distributed nature of the processes in which our Erlang compiles, which I thought was also interesting, because I was thinking this sort of how might, like, what might be the difference between Rust and Erlang in terms of handling garbage collection, for example. It seems like the Erlang compiler does it in time for all the different processes that's crashed independently. But that was interesting to note. But yeah, that's just me. I'll pass it on to Anurag.
Yeah, so it like I was thinking that how much of these the history of computing is actually involved in the intertwined with the politics of that time, and then what people think about. So we now actually know that like open source is a good way to do maybe the programming languages, but like I don't think it was really obvious in the early 90s or 80s that you could do open source and then it could get adoption. Like I think like if Erlang would have been like open sourced a little earlier, maybe more people would have used it. And like for example, like Linux basically took off because there was a lawsuit between AT&T and the FreeBSD people, and then like if that lawsuit would not have happened, then probably we might be using BSD based computers, something like that. So I was just wondering, like, how much of these small decisions like play into the history, and then like what we are basically using today is a result of those decisions some people made somewhere. For example, I think I remember John Carmack saying, when he was developing some technologies and he wanted to open source some of the technologies in the company, and then he was not, it was not easy to convince the people around him that open sourcing some things is like a good way to go forward at that time. And it also made me think about the programming languages which we use today, like could be like a result of the kind of computing we, or the kind of computers we build today. So most of the computers we use today are like processor centric, and like if let's say we would have like more memory centric computing, and then the programming languages which we would use for it might probably be different. So yeah, so those were my like primary thoughts, and yeah, I think we are done. Maybe passing on to Ben again.
Yep, floor is open for anybody who has second round comments. If nobody has any other comments, we can call it early today, and we'll be back next week with the APIs issue of the Increment magazine. And also, I think this was interesting. So if people find any other interesting articles on unique aspects of programming history, please post it in the Distributed Systems channel, and we'll schedule it somewhere. All right, see you guys next week.